You want me to leave? Then you're going to have to drag me off this land yourself because I buried my husband here, and I'm not going anywhere. Evelyn Harper said those words to the most powerful man in 3 counties while standing barefoot on scorched earth, her garage still smoking behind her with nothing left but the clothes on her back and a name on a business card she hadn't called yet. She had no idea that one phone call would shake the entire state of Arizona. If this story moves you, hit subscribe right now, drop your city in the comments below, and let me know where in the world you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me because what happens next will change the way you see people forever. The night it all started, Evelyn Harper was doing what she always did when the world went sideways. She was working with her hands. It was just past 10 o'clock. The desert had gone dark the way it does out in Maricopa County, that total swallowing darkness that makes you feel like the rest of the world doesn't exist. The storm had rolled in from the west around supper time, the kind of storm that doesn't announce itself politely, just arrives all at once with lightning and wind that bends the old mesquite trees sideways and sends tumbleweeds skidding across the highway like something trying to escape. Evelyn had her radio on, classic country. She liked the older stuff, Merle Haggard, Tammy Wynette songs that sounded like they'd been through something and lived to talk about it. She was elbow deep in a '94 Ford pickup engine that belonged to a retired school teacher named Dolores, who lived 12 miles out and couldn't afford to take the truck to the dealership in Phoenix. Evelyn had already told Dolores not to worry about the cost. She'd figure it out later. She always did. The garage her late husband Roy had built was small by most standards. 2 bays, a parts shelf that ran the entire length of the back wall, every bolt and gasket organized exactly the way Roy had left them 6 years ago. She hadn't moved a single thing. People thought that was grief. It wasn't entirely. It was also just the fact that Roy had organized that shelf better than any auto parts store she'd ever walked into, and she saw no reason to change what worked. She heard them before she saw them. Not the motorcycles the storm had swallowed most of the engine noise at PM. What she heard first was the voices. Rough clipped, a little too loud the way men get when they're frustrated and wet and trying not to show either one. She straightened up from the truck engine, wiped her hands on the rag she kept tucked into her belt, and walked to the open garage door. 6 motorcycles. Harleys, all of them. She could tell that much even before she got a good look. They were rolling into the gravel lot in front of the garage slowly the way vehicles move when something's wrong mechanically and the driver knows it. 2 of the bikes were being pushed by hand. The other 4 were running rough, sputtering, one of them throwing a small backfire that cracked like a rifle shot in the wet air. The men on them were big, leather cuts over heavy jackets, patches she recognized even from a distance, the skull with the wings, the lettering she'd seen on television news reports and in newspaper headlines that always seemed to treat the words like a warning. Hell's Angels. She stood in the light of her garage doorway and watched them come to a stop in her lot. One by one, the engines went quiet. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then the man in front swung his leg off his bike and stood up to his full height, and Evelyn figured he had to be at least 6'4", built like someone who'd spent decades doing hard physical work and hadn't slowed down yet. He had a gray beard that came down to his chest, eyes that were dark and tired, and a face that looked like it had made its peace with being misunderstood a long time ago. He looked at her standing in the doorway. She looked at him. He said, "Ma'am, we're real sorry to bother you. We had some trouble on the highway. We're not looking for any problems. We just need to know if there's a shop anywhere near here that might still be open." Evelyn looked past him at the 6 bikes. She looked at the rain coming sideways across the lot. She looked at the 2 men who were still standing beside the bikes they'd had to push, water dripping off their helmets, expressions that were carefully neutral in the way that meant they were working hard to appear non-threatening and knew exactly why that was necessary. She said, "There's nothing open within 40 miles in this weather. Come in out of the rain." The big man blinked. "Ma'am, we don't want to." "I didn't ask what you wanted," Evelyn said, not unkindly. "I said, come in. You're getting soaked, and those 2 bikes aren't going anywhere on their own. I've got coffee on, and I can take a look at what you're dealing with." She turned and walked back into the garage. After a moment, she heard it, that pause. The 6 men looking at each other with the wordless confusion of people who are not used to being invited in anywhere. They followed her. The man with the gray beard said his name was Ryder, just Ryder. He said it the way people say a name when it's the only one that matters anymore, when it's been so long since anyone called them anything else that the name on their birth certificate feels like it belongs to a different person entirely. The others were Dex Colmackie, a younger one everyone called Stretch because of his height, and a quiet man with a scarred jaw who was introduced only as Parrish. Evelyn handed out coffee mugs without asking who wanted any. She'd learned a long time ago that people who say they don't want coffee usually do. They just don't want to be any trouble. And in her garage, you were never any trouble, so the question was moot. She crouched beside the first bike that had been pushed in a big touring model with saddlebags worn smooth from years of road and started looking without waiting to be asked. Ryder stood a few feet back, mug in both hands, watching her. He said, "You sure you want to do this tonight? It's late. We can figure something out, maybe camp off the road until morning." In this storm. She didn't look up. "Absolutely not. Hand me that flashlight on the bench, would you? The long one second from the left." He got it without arguing. He handed it to her. She clicked it on and leaned in close. "Carburetor's flooded," she said almost immediately, "and your fuel line's got a hairline crack. See here where it's been weeping. Probably happened gradually, but the storm pressure and the temperature drop tonight finished it. How long has this one been running rough?" Ryder looked at the man named Dex, who was the one who'd been riding that particular bike. Dex said, "Couple weeks, maybe. Started as a hiccup. Got worse." "Always does," Evelyn said. She stood and moved to the next one. "This one's yours." She was looking at Parrish, the quiet man. He nodded. She crouched again. 30 seconds of silence. "Electrical issue. Voltage regulators failing, I'd guess, but let me pull the cover and confirm. You probably noticed your lights flickering." Parrish said, "Yeah." It's just that one word, but the way he said it, surprised like he hadn't expected her to nail it that fast, made one of the other men, Cole, let out a short laugh that he turned into a cough. Evelyn stood and looked at all 6 of them. "I can fix these tonight. All of them. It's going to take a few hours, and I'll need you to stay out of my way and let me work, but I can do it." She paused. "I've also got some leftover chili on the stove in the house if anybody's hungry. It's nothing fancy." For a moment, not a single one of them said a word. Then Ryder said in a voice that was very quiet and very serious, "Why are you doing this?" Evelyn looked at him like the question was mildly confusing. "Because you need help, and I can give it," she said. "That's the only reason there needs to be." She worked through the night. The men, to their credit, did exactly what she asked. They stayed out of her way. They arranged themselves on the old wooden chairs and the cooler she'd never bothered moving out of the second bay, and they drank coffee and they talked among themselves in low voices. Occasionally, one of them would ask if they could help, and she'd give them something specific and practical. "Hold this, hand me that, keep pressure here for a second," and they'd do it without question, which she appreciated. She dealt with men who couldn't take direction from a woman without making a whole performance of it, and these 6 weren't that. They took their cues from her in her own space without any of that noise, which raised them several notches in her estimation without them knowing it. Around midnight, while she was working on Parrish's electrical system, Ryder sat down on a stool about 8 feet away and said, "You've been doing this a long time." "Since I was 16, she said. "My daddy had a shop. Wasn't supposed to be mine. I've got 2 brothers, but neither one of them had the patience for it, so it ended up mine anyway. And the garage, this one specifically," she kept her eyes on the wiring. "My husband Roy built it. Took him 2 summers. He wasn't a mechanic, he was a carpenter actually, but he wanted me to have a real shop, not just a converted shed. He was particular about things being done right." Ryder was quiet for a moment. "Then he's passed. 6 years ago." She said it the way you say something you've made peace with, not the way you say something that still has raw edge to, though anyone paying close attention would have noticed both were true. "Heart attack, fast, which I'm told I should be grateful for, and I am. I just don't always feel it." Ryder nodded slowly. He didn't say "I'm sorry for your loss" or any of the other phrases people use as filler when they don't know what else to say. He just nodded like he understood that some things don't need commentary, they just need to be acknowledged and then allowed to sit. She liked him better for it. Around 2 in the morning, the younger one, Stretch, came to stand nearby while she was doing a final check on the last carburetor and said very quietly, almost like he was embarrassed, "Ma'am, I just want to say we've been on the road 3 weeks, and this is the first time since we left Montana that anybody's opened a door for us." Evelyn looked up at him. He was young, couldn't have been more than 25, 26. Under the leather and the road grime, he looked like somebody's kid, which of course he was. She said, "That's a long time to be shut out." He said, "We're kind of used to it." She went back to her work, but she thought about that for a long time afterward. By 3:30 in this morning, all 6 motorcycles were running. She lined them up in the second bay and started each one in turn, listening to the engines with her eyes half closed. The way her father had taught her, not just hearing the sound, but feeling it, the way you feel for a steady heartbeat. Each one came up clean and even, no hesitation, no roughness. She shut the last one down and straightened up and found all 6 men on their feet watching her. Ryder reached into his cut and pulled out a thick folded stack of cash. "Name your price," he said. "Whatever it is, we'll cover it. You've been up all night." Evelyn looked at the money. She looked at him. She shook her head. "Put that away." "Ma'am," I said, "put it away, Ryder." She said his name for the first time, and something shifted slightly in the room when she did, like using his name, made the moment real in a different way. "I didn't do this for money. I did it because you needed help." "Then let us do something," he said. There was something in his voice that surprised her. Something almost urgent, like being refused was harder to accept than any difficult job. "Let us at least, there was a shingle blown loose on your roof when we pulled in. I noticed it. Let Dex take a look. He's good with structural stuff." "In the middle of the night in a rainstorm," she said flatly. "In the morning then, we can stay, sleep in the second bay we don't need. Ryder." She held up a hand. He stopped. She said, "If it really means something to you to give something back, then help somebody else someday. That's all. Find somebody who needs it and help them. That's how this works." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly and with a gravity that she didn't fully understand, yet the way you nod when you've just made a commitment to something, not just when you're agreeing to be polite. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small card. He held it out to her. She took it. Big Ryder. Hell's Angels MC, a phone number underneath. "You ever need anything," he said, "you call that number. Day or night." She tucked the card into her shirt pocket. "Travel safe," she said, "all of you." They left at first light, all 6 engines running smooth and true, the sound of them fading down the highway until the desert swallowed it whole. Evelyn stood in the doorway of her garage and watched until she couldn't hear them anymore. Then she went inside, poured the last of the coffee, and sat down at Roy's old work table in the back. She didn't know that in 4 days, everything she had left in the world would be gone. She didn't know that the quiet morning she was sitting in the birds just starting up the storm, wrung out the desert doing what the desert does after rain, which is smell like something alive, was the last quiet morning she would have for a very long time. She didn't know that the card in her shirt pocket was the most important thing she owned. She just sat and drank her coffee and listened to the birds the way Roy used to do, and thought about the young one Stretch, saying we're kind of used to it, with no bitterness in his voice at all. Just a fact, just a thing that was true about the world as he'd found it. She thought, that's not right. That's just not right at all. And she thought about her husband, Roy, who had spent 40 years handing tools to strangers on the side of the road without being asked, who had taught her that kindness isn't a transaction. It's a direction. You give it outward and trust that it circulates. It doesn't always come back to you, but it comes back. It always comes back somewhere. She didn't know how soon she was about to need that to be true. She pulled the card out of her pocket and set it on the work table in front of her, under Roy's old coffee mug that she still used every morning, and the one that said "World's Okayest Mechanic" because he thought it was funny. She looked at it for a moment, then she went to wash up for the day. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. She almost missed it. It had been tucked between an electric bill and an auto parts catalog, the way things are when someone wants them to look routine. Plain white envelope, official-looking return address from a county tax assessment office she'd never heard of and couldn't immediately place. She opened it at the kitchen table. She read it twice. Then she sat very still for a while. The letter stated that due to a reassessment of property records dating back to 1987, Evelyn Harper was found to be in arrears on property tax payments totaling $31,412, and that if said amount was not paid within 30 days, the county would initiate proceedings to seize and liquidate the property to satisfy the debt. $31,000. She'd been paying her property taxes on time every year for 32 years. She had the receipts going back to 1991 in a filing cabinet in Roy's study. She kept everything. Roy had been meticulous about records, and she'd learned it from him like she'd learned everything by watching, by doing, by understanding that details matter, because the world will use your carelessness against you if you give it the chance. She got up from the table, went to the filing cabinet, and pulled the property tax folder. She checked the last 5 years. Paid, 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 paid. On time, every one of them. Receipts with confirmation numbers. She called the county tax office. On hold for 40 minutes, then transferred. Then told that the person she needed to speak to wasn't available. Then given a different number to call. She called that number, a recorded message. She left her name and number and was never called back. She told herself it was a mistake, a clerical error. These things happened. She did not yet know the name Victor Crane, but she was about to learn it. He came on a Thursday morning driving a black SUV with tinted windows that was too expensive for the road conditions out here and made no attempt to look like it belonged. He was maybe 55 trim in a suit that cost more than most people in this county, made in a month with a smile that was practiced and warm in the way that means neither one. He stood at the edge of her lot, didn't come all the way up. She noticed stayed back by his vehicle in a way that was calculated to look casual. And he said, "Mrs. Harper, I'm Victor Crane. I believe we have some mutual interest to discuss." Evelyn dried her hands on her rag. She said, "We've never met, Mr. Crane. We don't have mutual interests." He smiled wider. "Your property," he said, "sits in a very strategic location. I'm a developer. I've been working on a project in this region for several years now, a resort and entertainment complex that will bring significant economic benefit to the entire area. Jobs, infrastructure, tax revenue." "I've heard that speech before," she said. "What do you want?" "I'd like to buy your property. It's not for sale." The smile held, but something behind it recalibrated. "Mrs. Harper, the offer I'm prepared to make is extremely generous. More than fair market value by a significant margin. I think if you look at your current situation—" "My current situation is fine," she said. "Good morning, Mr. Crane." She went back into the garage. She heard his car door close eventually, heard the engine start, heard the SUV back out of her lot and roll away down the highway. She stood at her workbench for a moment with her hands flat on the surface, not working, just standing. "My current situation is fine." She'd believed that when she said it. She had no idea that by the time he reached the highway, the thing he'd put in motion, the thing that had already been in motion for weeks, was accelerating toward her life like weather she couldn't see yet. The next letter arrived 4 days later. This one wasn't from the tax office. The second letter wasn't from a government office. It didn't have a county seal or an official letterhead. It came in a plain envelope with no return address, printed on heavy cream-colored paper that felt expensive in a way that made her vaguely sick. It was from a law firm, Hargrove Dunn and Associates, with an address in Phoenix. 3 paragraphs of dense legal language that she read, standing at the kitchen counter, then sat down and read again slowly moving her finger under each line the way her mother had taught her to do when something important needed to be understood exactly, not approximately. The substance of it was this: a company called Sonoran Land Holdings, LLC, was asserting a claim to approximately 1.4 acres of her property based on a deed transfer executed in 1987, which they claimed had never been properly recorded, but which they were now prepared to enforce. Attached was a photocopy of a document she had never seen in her life, a deed with her father-in-law's signature on it. Roy's father, Harold Harper, who had died in 1993, transferring the eastern portion of her lot to a holding company that no longer existed, but whose assets the letter claimed had been absorbed by Sonoran Land Holdings through a chain of corporate transfers that took up an entire additional page to explain. She set the letter down. She picked up the phone and called her county recorder's office because Roy had taught her to go to primary sources and not let other people's paperwork define her reality. She was on hold for 22 minutes. When she finally got a person, she described what she had. The woman on the other end said she couldn't give legal advice, that Evelyn would need to consult an attorney. Evelyn asked if she could at least confirm whether any such deed transfer had ever been recorded against her property. The woman said she'd have to submit a records request in writing. Evelyn asked how long that would take. The woman said 3 to 5 business weeks. Evelyn said, very quietly, "The letter gives me 30 days to respond." The woman said she was very sorry, but that was the process. Evelyn hung up. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Not panicking, she wasn't built for panic. Roy used to say she didn't have the gear for it, which he meant as the highest compliment. But thinking hard methodically the way you think when the problem in front of you is real and the clock is already running. She needed an attorney. She knew one in town, Bill Garrett, who'd handled Roy's estate, a decent man who mostly did wills and property transfers, and had the kind of practice that runs fine in a small county until something serious shows up. She called his office. His secretary told her he was in court in Tucson for the week. Could she leave a message? She left a message. She called the county assessor's office about the first letter, the tax one, got a voicemail, left another message. She went back out to the garage and got to work on Dolores's truck, because standing still while waiting has never fixed anything, and her hands knew how to keep moving even when the rest of her was churning. It was while she was working around noon that Tom Birch came by. Tom ran the feed store 2 miles down the road and had been something like a friend to her and Roy for 30 years, the kind of friend you don't see every week, but who's always been there and who you'd call in a real emergency without thinking twice. He was 62, slow-moving, steady, with the kind of calm that comes from decades of physical work and not much illusion about the world. He pulled his truck into her lot and sat in the cab for a moment before getting out, which was unusual for Tom. When he came into the garage, he wasn't quite meeting her eyes, which was more unusual still. She said, "Tom, what's wrong?" He said, "You heard the name Victor Crane yet?" She dried her hands. "He came by Thursday, offered to buy the property." Tom nodded like that was the answer he'd expected and hadn't been hoping for. He said, "That man has been buying up land in this county for 3 years. Everything between the highway and the ridge, almost all of it, he's got it now. Yours is the last piece he doesn't have." "I know," she said. "It's not for sale. I know it's not for sale." He finally looked at her. "What I'm telling you is that when Crane can't buy something, things start happening. The Delgados over on Route 9, he wanted their 10 acres. They said no. 3 months later, they had an EP, a complaint, filed against them for runoff from a field that hadn't had runoff in 40 years. Turned out to be fabricated, but by the time it got cleared up, they were broke from the legal fees and they sold." He paused. "The Munozes. Same story, different angle zoning violation that nobody had ever heard of against a building that had been standing since 1974. Evelyn stood very still. She said, "You're telling me the tax letter is him?" Tom said, "I'm telling you I don't know that for certain. I'm telling you to be careful, and I'm telling you that a man with his kind of money has a lot of levers to pull, and that you should not. Ev, please, you should not try to fight this alone." She said, "Do you know an attorney?" He said, "Not one who's in his weight class." She looked at the card she'd left sitting on Roy's work table. She'd been looking at it off and on all week without touching it. She said, "I'll figure it out." Tom left looking like a man who wanted to say more but didn't know how. She went back to work. The inspectors came the following Monday. 2 of them county health and safety clipboards and the particular manner of men who have decided in advance what they're going to find. They walked her garage from end to end, measured things, photographed things, spoke to each other in low voices that weren't quite low enough for her not to catch fragments. Ventilation inadequate for commercial operation. Waste disposal non-compliant. Electrical panel pre-code. She followed them at a distance. She'd been through inspections before this building had passed, every one of them since Roy finished it in 1998, and she knew what legitimate inspection looked like. It looked like 2 men checking things against the standard. What this looked like was 2 men building a case. When they finished, the senior inspector, a thin man with careful eyes named Rollins, handed her a preliminary notice of violations and said she had 21 days to bring the facility into compliance or face a temporary closure order. She looked at the list. 14 items. She said, "Mr. Rollins, this garage passed its last inspection 14 months ago with no violations noted. Every item on this list was present and in the same condition at that inspection." He said, "Standards change, ma'am." She said, "Do they change retroactively?" He said, "I'm just doing my job." She said, "Are you?" He looked at her steadily. Something moved behind his eyes that she couldn't read, not guilt exactly, but not nothing either. Then he said, "Have a good day, Mrs. Harper," and left. She called Bill Garrett's office again. He was back from Tucson. She got through. She explained everything, the tax letter, the property claim, the inspection. All of it in order the way Roy had taught her to present problems, facts first, sequence second, your interpretation third. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Evelyn, how much do you know about Victor Crane? She said, Tom Birch told me about the Delgados and the Munozes. There are others, Garrett said. I've seen his playbook twice before in this county. He goes in with a fair offer, first document, everything from here on out, and when that doesn't work, he starts creating legal noise, tax issues, zoning, environmental. The idea is to bury you in enough paperwork and enough fees and enough stress that eventually it's just easier to sell. She said, then I won't sell. Garrett said, Evelyn, the legal fees alone to fight each one of these could run to $20,000 or $30,000 before we even get near a courtroom. And he's got attorneys on retainer who do nothing but this. She said, Bill, can you fight it or not? He said, I can fight the tax issue. That one looks straightforwardly fraudulent, and I think I can get it dismissed. The property deed claim is more complicated because whoever put that document together knew what they were doing. It's going to take a forensic document examiner and probably an expert witness. That's not cheap. She said, how much? He named a number. She was quiet. He said gently, I'm sorry. She said, don't be sorry yet. Let me think. She hung up and went and stood in the middle of Roy's garage and put her hands flat on the hood of Dolores's truck, which she still hadn't finished because everything had been going sideways for 2 weeks, and she stood there with her eyes closed and thought about Roy. Roy, who had spent 6 months building this garage and had refused to cut a single corner even when the materials ran over budget. Who had said, we're building this to last, Ev, not to be convenient. Who had trusted her with everything he'd made, this land, this building, his name, and who had died without, for 1 second, imagining it would need to be defended from a man in an expensive suit with a manufactured paper trail. She thought he'd know what to do. And then she thought, no, he'd know what I should do, which is what I already know. I'm just scared. She opened her eyes. She looked at the business card on the work table. She didn't pick it up. Not yet. 3 days later, she came home at 11 at night after a long day to find that someone had been through her filing cabinet. She knew it the way you know when someone's been in your house, not because anything obvious was missing or broken, but because of the small wrongnesses. The cabinet drawer that she always left with the lock engaged unlocked. The Roy's folder not quite in its proper place, 2 folders ahead of where it should have been, like someone had pulled it out, looked through it, and put it back in a hurry. The copy of the original property deed, the real one, her deed, the one that proved what she owned, and when she'd owned it, gone. She stood in front of that open cabinet and felt something she hadn't let herself feel yet. Not fear, not helplessness, pure cold fury. Because they had come into Roy's house. They had gone through Roy's things. They had taken something Roy had left her to protect. She stood there with that fury, and she let herself feel all of it, every degree of it. And then she picked up the phone and called Bill Garrett's emergency line and left a message. And then she called the county sheriff's non-emergency line and reported a break-in. And while she was on hold waiting for the deputy to come, she went to the kitchen and made herself a cup of tea and sat at the table and made a list. Everything she still had copies of, everything that could be reconstructed, everything that proved what she knew to be true. The list was longer than she'd feared it would be. Roy had kept duplicates of many things filed in a separate accordion folder she found at the back of the closet shelf where he kept his important personal papers. The original deed wasn't among them, but the title insurance policy was, and the tax receipts were, and a hand-drawn survey of the property boundaries that Roy's father had commissioned in 1979 with Harold Harper's signature on it and the notary stamp and the date. Harold Harper, the man whose signature was supposedly on the fraudulent 1987 transfer. In 1979, she looked at the date on the survey Harold Harper had been alive. In 1987, when the supposed deed transfer occurred, Harold Harper had also been alive. He hadn't died until 1993. So whoever had forged that document hadn't necessarily made the simple mistake of using a dead man's signature. But Bill Garrett would know what that meant better than she did. She sat with her tea and her list and waited for the deputy. The deputy who came was young and earnest and wrote everything down carefully and told her he was sorry and that they would do their best. She thanked him and did not tell him what she actually thought, which was that she expected very little from an official process in a county where she was starting to understand that Victor Crane had been operating for 3 years without meaningful opposition. After he left, she sat alone in the kitchen. It was 2 in the morning. She was 68 years old. She had $31,000 in fabricated tax debt hanging over her. She had a fraudulent property claim against 1.4 acres of her land. She had 14 manufactured code violations threatening to shut her garage. She had a stolen deed, a missing document that would take human money to reconstruct in court. She had a lawyer who was good but outgunned. She had a county system that may or may not be compromised. She had a business card. She got up. She went to the work table and she picked up the card and she held it in both hands and she thought about what it meant to make this call. She thought about what people would say. She thought about the way Tom Birch would look at her, the way her daughter-in-law in Scottsdale would react, the assumptions people would make. She thought about Stretch saying we're kind of used to it with no bitterness in his voice at all. She thought about Ryder nodding when she said help somebody else. Someday nodding in that way that meant he'd taken it in as a real commitment, not just a pleasantry. She thought about what Roy would say. Roy would say, you helped them when they needed it. That's done. Now you need help. Call. She called. It rang 4 times. Then a voice rough with sleep but instantly alert, the way some people get when they've spent years training themselves to come awake fast. Yeah. She said, Ryder, this is Evelyn Harper. You came through my lot in a storm about 3 weeks ago. 6 bikes. I fixed. I know who you are, he said. And the way he said it, immediate, warm, no hesitation at all, undid something in her chest she hadn't known she'd been holding tightly together. She said, I think I need help. There was a pause. Not a long one. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then Ryder said, tell me everything. She did. She talked for 20 minutes straight, which was 20 minutes longer than she'd talked about herself to another human being in 6 years, and he didn't interrupt her once. Not to ask questions, not to offer opinions, not to say, oh my God, or are you serious, or any of the things people say when they're really just waiting for their turn to talk. He listened the way a person listens when they're actually building something out of what they're hearing. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Mrs. Harper, are you safe tonight? Physically safe? She said, yes. He said, okay, don't touch anything in that filing cabinet. Don't move anything in the house. I want somebody who knows what to look for to go through that room before you disturb it further. He paused. I know people, good people, people who know about property fraud and document forensics. I'm going to make some calls. She said, Ryder, I don't want Evelyn. He used her first name, just like she'd used his 3 weeks ago in the garage, and something shifted the same way it had then, the way a name makes a moment real. You told me to help somebody else someday. I'm going to do that now. Will you let me? She sat there at Roy's work table at 2 in the morning with the card in her hand and Roy's coffee mug next to her in the filing cabinet standing open in the next room, and 30 years of her life under threat from a man who'd decided she was an obstacle. She said, okay. He said, I'll call you in the morning. Lock your doors. After she hung up, she sat for a while longer in the quiet. Then for the first time in 3 weeks, she slept. She didn't know that while she slept, Ryder was already on 3 different calls. She didn't know that by morning, a message had gone out through a network that stretched across 6 states. She didn't know that what she'd set in motion with one act of kindness in a rainstorm was about to become something neither she nor Victor Crane had any frame of reference for. She just slept, and the desert was quiet around her house. And 4 states away, the road started to fill. She woke at 6 the next morning to 3 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize, and 1 voicemail from Ryder that had come in at 4:17 a.m. She played the voicemail while standing in the kitchen in her robe waiting for the coffee to brew. His voice was steady, no trace of sleep in it, like he'd been awake for hours and hadn't minded Evelyn. I've talked to some people. There's an attorney I want you to speak with. His name is Marcus Webb. He's based in Tucson, and he knows property fraud cases the way you know engines. He's going to call you at 7 this morning. Pick up even if you don't recognize the number. He's already looked at what I described, and he has some things to tell you. Don't talk to anyone else about the deed situation until you've talked to him. Trust me on that. She poured her coffee. At 7 o'clock exactly, her phone rang. Marcus Webb had a voice like a man who had spent 20 years in courtrooms and had long since stopped being impressed by anything but the way he spoke to her was precise and respectful and moved fast. He didn't waste her time with pleasantries. Within 2 minutes, he was asking her specific questions about the deed claim dates, names the chain of corporate transfers listed in the letter, and she answered each one from memory because she'd read that letter so many times in the past week that she could have recited it backward. When she finished, he was quiet for 4 seconds. She counted. Then he said, "Mrs. Harper, whoever put this together knew enough about property law to make it look right on the surface. But they made two mistakes. The first is that the notary stamp on that 1987 document belongs to a woman named Clara Rice, who I happen to know retired from notary work in 1984. She couldn't have notarized a document in 1987 because she wasn't licensed to do so. The second mistake is smaller but more interesting. The corporate chain they're using to connect the original holding company to Sonoranland Holdings passes through a shell company that wasn't registered in Arizona until 2019. You can't have a 1987 asset transfer land in a company that didn't legally exist until 32 years later." Evelyn set her coffee mug down very carefully. She said, "So it's fabricated." He said front to back, and whoever did this was sophisticated enough to know most people wouldn't catch it. They were counting on you being scared enough or financially exhausted enough to not look closely. He paused. "Ryder tells me you were neither of those things." She said, "Not yet, anyway." He almost laughed. She could hear it just barely at the edges of his voice. "I want to take this case," he said, "and I want to do it on contingency, which means I don't get paid unless we win, and when we win, we go after Crane for attorney's fees. I need you to give me authorization to pull the full property records on your lot. Access your tax payment history and contact the county sheriff about the break-in separately from whatever report you filed last night. I have a contact there I trust." She said, "Bill Garrett has already started on the tax issue." "Good, I'll coordinate with him. Garrett's solid, he just doesn't do litigation." "I do." Another pause, shorter this time. "Mrs. Harper, this isn't going to be quick and it isn't going to be calm. Crane is going to escalate when he realizes you have real legal representation. I want you to be prepared for that." She said, "What does escalate mean specifically?" He said, "More pressure, faster. He'll try to create a situation where fighting back costs more than settling. He's done it before in other counties. I've seen his pattern. He'll go after your garage license, your business registration, anything with a regulatory angle. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes it gets more personal than that." The word personal sat in the air between them. She said, "How personal?" He said, "I've seen intimidation, vandalism. One case up in Pinal County, a structure fire that the insurance investigator called suspicious origin." She was quiet. He said, "I'm not telling you this to frighten you. I'm telling you because you need to know what you're dealing with, and you need to make a clear-eyed decision about whether you want to fight this." She said without hesitating, "I want to fight this," he said. "Good, then we start today." Shit on. The call lasted another 40 minutes. By the time she hung up, she had a legal strategy, a timeline, and the first solid feeling she'd had in 2 weeks that she was not entirely without weapons. She called Bill Garrett and told him about Marcus Webb. Garrett knew the name. There was a warmth in his voice when he heard it, the warmth of a man who's been handed reinforcement. He didn't expect and is genuinely relieved by it. He said, "Webb's the real deal, Evelyn. If anyone can take Crane apart in court, it's him." She said, "He thinks Crane is going to escalate." Garrett said, "He's right, so lock your doors and document everything. Every vehicle you don't recognize in your lot, take a photo. Every phone call, write down the time and what was said. Every piece of mail, keep the envelope." She wrote all of that down. She spent the rest of that day working Dolores's truck, finally finished, plus a clutch job on a kid's beater Civic that had been sitting in her second bay for a week because the work kept her steady and because staying steady was now a form of resistance. Victor Crane was counting on her to destabilize. She would not destabilize. She would fix engines and drink coffee and document everything and let Marcus Webb do what Marcus Webb did, and she would stay on her land. It was while she was finishing the Civic at around 5 in the afternoon that Tom Birch came back. He sat on the cooler in the second bay the way he had 100 times over 30 years and watched her work, and for a while neither of them said anything, which was also something they'd done 100 times and which meant he had something to say but was working up to it. She said, I'll say it, Tom. He said, Crane's been talking around town. She kept working, talking how, telling people you're going to lose the property anyway, that the tax issue and the deed claim together are going to force a sale inside of 60 days, and that anyone who his word entangles themselves in your situation is going to find themselves on the wrong side of some very expensive legal attention. Tom's voice was flat and even, but she could hear what was underneath it. He came into my store, Ev, stood right there at my counter and told me that. She straightened up. She said, he came into your store personally. Yesterday afternoon, bought a bottle of water, had a conversation, very casual. Tom looked at her. He's warning people away from you. That's what's happening. She felt the fury again, that cold, clean burn, but she kept her face level. She said, what did you say to him? Tom said, I told him I didn't take business advice from people who buy a bottle of water and call it a purchase, and then I asked him to leave. She looked at him. He shrugged, but his jaw was tight. She said, Tom, you don't have to. I know I don't have to. He met her eyes directly. Roy Harper helped me out of a situation in 2008 that I've never told you about because he made me promise not to. But it was the kind of help that changes things, Ev. The kind you don't forget. He stood up from the cooler. So whatever you need, you tell me. I don't care what that man says about entanglement. She nodded. Her throat was tight in a way she didn't let show. I'll tell you if I need something, she said. He left, and she stood in the quiet of the garage, and she thought, Roy, you've been gone 6 years, and you're still in this town protecting people. And she didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so she didn't either, and she went back to the Civic's clutch, because the car wasn't going to fix itself. 2 days later, the garage was firebombed. She'd been in the house, 11:30 at night, and she'd come inside an hour earlier, which was not typical. She often worked late, but she'd had a headache all day, and for once had listened to her body and gone in early. She heard it before she felt it, a sound she couldn't immediately identify. Not an explosion exactly, more like a deep concussive thump, followed immediately by the sound of glass, and then a roar that she understood in her bones before her conscious mind caught up with it. She was out the back door in seconds, and by the time she reached the corner of the house, she could see the orange light of it, and she knew. She called 911 while she was running. She told them her address and said structure, fire, and then she stopped running because there was nothing she could run toward. The fire had moved through the garage with a speed that told her it hadn't started by accident, that whoever had done this had made sure it would go fast and total no chance of saving anything. She stood in her slippers and her robe, and she watched Roy's garage burn. She did not cry. She was too far past crying for that. What she felt was a grief so complete and so cold that it didn't have room for tears. It was the grief of watching something Roy had built with his own hands, something that had been the center of her life for 26 years, be taken from her on purpose, deliberately as a message. The fire trucks came. The firefighters were good and fast, and they kept it from spreading to the house, which was something. The garage itself was gone in under an hour. 32 years of tools and parts, and Roy's organized shelves, and the old radio, and Dolores's truck, and the kids' Civic, and every piece of equipment she owned. The fire chief came and stood beside her while the crews were still working and said, Mrs. Harper, I have to tell you the pattern of this fire is not consistent with an accidental cause. The origin points we're seeing suggest accelerant was used in at least 2 locations. He paused. We're going to have an arson investigator out here first thing tomorrow. She said, thank you. He said, is there somewhere you can stay tonight? She said, I'm staying here. He looked at her. She was 68 years old in her bathrobe in the middle of the night with her garage destroyed, and he said gently, ma'am. She said, I am staying here, on my land. Thank you for your work tonight. He nodded and left her alone, and she stood there until the last truck pulled away, and then she went inside and sat at the kitchen table and called Marcus Webb. He picked up on the second ring. She said, they burned my garage. A pause, a short one. Then, are you hurt? No. Are you in the house? Yes. Lock the doors. All of them. His voice was controlled, but there was something in it now, a sharpening, like a blade being drawn. I'm calling the county sheriff's arson unit directly tonight. I'm also calling a contact at the Arizona Attorney General's office. This changes things, Evelyn. This isn't harassment anymore. This is a felony, and I am going to make absolutely sure that tomorrow morning Victor Crane wakes up knowing that. She said, Marcus, I lost everything in that garage. He was quiet for a moment, not filling the silence with noise, just letting it be what it was. Then he said, I know, and I am sorry. I am genuinely sorry. Another pause. He made a mistake doing this, a serious one. People who operate the way he operates, they stay clean. They use paperwork and legal pressure because it's untraceable. The moment he crossed into arson, he handed us something we didn't have before. She said, what, Em? He said, desperation. He's desperate, Evelyn. That means you're closer to winning than you knew. She sat with that. She said, call me in the morning. I'll call you at 7, he said. Keep your phone charged. She hung up, and then Victor Crane came. She heard the car before she saw the headlights through the front window, that same expensive engine she'd heard once before pulling out of her lot, and she stood up from the table and walked to the front door and opened it before he could knock because she was done waiting for anything. He was standing on her porch steps in the middle of the night in a suit that looked like he'd put it on specifically to come here, and his expression was the careful mask of a man delivering an ultimatum he's been rehearsing. He said, Mrs. Harper, I heard about the fire. I'm sorry for your loss. She said, get off my porch. His expression didn't waver. I think this would be a good time for us to revisit the conversation we had last week. In light of everything that's happened, my offer, get off my porch. He was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted in his face. The careful warmth dropped away like a mask finally slipping, and what was underneath it was cold and matter-of-fact in the way of a man who doesn't think of other people as fully real. He said, you've lost your garage. You've got legal debt piling up. You're 68 years old and you're alone out here, and the only person fighting your corner is an attorney working on contingency who has a very long road ahead of him. He paused. I'm offering you a clean exit, a number that lets you start over somewhere else without any of this following you. She looked at him. She looked at this man who had spent 3 years swallowing up this county, piece by piece, who had burned Roy's garage to the ground, to make a point, who had come to her door in the middle of the night because he expected grief and exhaustion and isolation to have done what his lawyers hadn't. She said, Victor, I want you to hear me clearly. I'm not selling. Not tonight, not next week, not ever. And I want you to know something else. She took one step forward, so she was exactly at the edge of the porch, close enough that he could see her face clearly in the dark. I made a phone call 2 days ago, and the person I called made some more calls. And I think the next few weeks are going to surprise you. He studied her, looking for the bluff, looking for the fear underneath the words. He said, you're alone, Mrs. Harper. She said I was. She went back inside and locked the door. She stood on the other side of it for a moment, listening to his footsteps on the gravel, the car door, the engine. Then she went to the kitchen and picked up her phone and did something she hadn't let herself do yet in all of this. She called Ryder. He picked up on the first ring. She said, he came to my house tonight after the fire. He came to my house at midnight and stood on my porch and tried to buy me out. Ryder said nothing for 2 full seconds. And in those 2 seconds, she heard something change in his breathing, something that was very controlled and very quiet, the way people get when they are deciding carefully how to handle an anger they actually feel. Then he said, he stood on your porch. She said, yes. He said, Evelyn, I need you to listen to me. What's about to happen, I want you to know it was already in motion before tonight. But tonight just moved the timeline up. He paused. How much of your property can fit 500 motorcycles? She blinked. She said, I'm sorry. He said, the lot, the field behind the house, the road frontage. Rough estimate. She said slowly, Ryder, what are you? He said, rough estimate, Evelyn. She thought about it. She said, the lot and the field together are maybe 3 acres. The road frontage is another 100 yards. He said, that'll work. She said, what is happening? He said, you helped 6 men in a storm. You told us to help somebody else someday. His voice was level and warm and absolutely certain. We took that seriously. We just needed to know who. She stood in her kitchen at 1 a.m. with the smell of smoke still in her clothes and the ruins of Roy's garage 30 feet from her back door, and she felt something she hadn't felt in 3 weeks. She felt like the ground under her feet was solid again. She said when he said, start watching the highway at dawn, she didn't sleep. She told herself she would try, lay down on top of the bed covers, still in her clothes, set her phone on the pillow beside her, closed her eyes. But sleep didn't come. And after an hour, she stopped pretending and got up and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table in the dark and waited for dawn, the way you wait for something you've been told is coming but can't yet imagine the shape of. 500 motorcycles. She kept turning the number over in her mind, the way you turn a strange object in your hands trying to understand what it actually is. She'd heard Ryder say it. She'd heard herself ask when and heard him answer dawn. And yet some part of her mind kept offering the rational explanation that she had misunderstood, that the stress and the smoke and the midnight visit from Victor Crane had scrambled something in her processing, that what was coming was something smaller and more manageable and more within the boundaries of what the world normally did. But she'd heard his voice, and she'd heard the certainty in it. She was on her third cup of coffee when her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize, just 3 words. "We're 20 out." She put the cup down and walked to the front window. The highway was still dark, still empty. The desert before dawn has a particular quality of silence that is different from night silence, thinner somehow, like the quiet is already anticipating what comes next. She stood at the window and watched. She heard it before she saw it. A low vibration, first more felt than heard, the way you feel a large truck approaching on a road you can't yet see. Then it built, not the sound of one engine, not even the sound of 6 engines, but a layered rolling thunder that seemed to come from the direction of the highway and kept growing instead of peaking and fading the way a single vehicle does. It grew and didn't stop growing, and she pressed her hand flat against the cold glass of the window, and her heart was doing something she couldn't name exactly. Something between terror and wonder, and a grief so mixed up with gratitude she couldn't separate the two. The first headlight appeared on the highway, then 10. Then she stopped counting. They came in a column that stretched back further than she could see in the gray pre-dawn light, 2 by 2, orderly and deliberate, the sound of them filling the desert completely, and they were turning off the highway into her road that had never held more than a handful of vehicles at a time, and they kept coming, and they kept coming, and they kept coming. She opened the front door and stood on the porch. Ryder was first. He pulled into her lot and swung off his bike in one motion and walked toward her. And in the gray light of early morning, he looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from riding through the night. But his eyes were clear and direct. And when he reached the porch steps, he stopped and looked at her for a moment without saying anything. She said, "How many?" He said, "Final count's still coming in. Last I heard 512. She gripped the porch railing. She said, "Ryder, these people rode through the night." He said, "Some of them rode 2 nights. He said it simply as a fact, not as a bid for gratitude. Montana, New Mexico, Colorado, Nevada, word went out and people came. That's how it works." She looked past him at the lot, which was now completely full, and the road, which was completely full, and she could hear the last of them still pulling in off the highway, the sound of 500 engines going quiet one by one, like a wave breaking slowly across a shore. She said, "I don't know what to say to you." He said, "Then don't say anything. Just tell me where you want us." The flatbed trucks arrived 40 minutes later. 3 of them loaded with lumber and steel and concrete bags and roofing materials and tools, not rented tools. Owned tools, the kind of equipment that serious people bring to a job they intend to finish. Behind the flatbeds came 2 panel vans and a pickup carrying generators and an air compressor and 2 portable welding rigs. And then the van that Ryder had told her about, the one she hadn't fully believed in, until it pulled up and parked, and a man in a charcoal suit got out carrying a soft leather briefcase. He was maybe 45, lean, with the particular composed energy of someone who has spent his professional life in rooms where a great deal is at stake and has learned to treat that as normal. He walked to where Evelyn was standing at the edge of the lot and extended his hand and said, "Mrs. Harper, I'm Daniel Foss. I'm an attorney out of Phoenix. I've been working with Marcus Webb on your case for the past 36 hours. She shook his hand. "I didn't know Marcus had a partner on this." Foss said, "He didn't until 2 days ago. I was brought in specifically for the criminal angle, arson, fraud, bribery of public officials. That's my lane." He opened his briefcase and withdrew a folder. "I'd like to walk you through what we have, if you have 15 minutes. She said, "I have whatever you need." They sat at her kitchen table while outside the sound of 500 people beginning to work created a backdrop that was unlike anything she'd ever heard, from that kitchen voice and power tools starting up, the heavy clank of lumber being unloaded, someone calling instructions across the lot in a voice built for job sites. Foss laid documents on the table methodically, one at a time, explaining each one in plain language without condescending to her. The first, a financial trail connecting Sonoran Land Holdings, LLC, the company claiming part of her property directly to a larger holding company with Victor Crane's name in the ownership structure. Not hidden well enough for most people, but not for someone who knew where to look. The second, a communication chain, emails obtained legally through a contact in the county assessor's office who had come forward voluntarily, showing coordination between Crane's legal team and two county employees, one in the tax office and one in the building inspection division. The fabricated tax debt, the 14 manufactured code violations, coordinated, documented in writing. The third, a report from an arson investigator, not the county's, a private one, hired by Foss's firm, and cleared to examine the scene at first light, stating that the fire at Evelyn's garage had been set using a specific accelerant compound introduced at 3 points along the structure's base, and that this pattern was consistent with a professional application, not an amateur one. She looked at the third document for a long time. Foss said quietly, "The arson investigator has done expert witness work in 14 states. His testimony is considered ironclad." She said, "Can you connect it to Crane directly?" Foss said, "Not yet. That's the honest answer. We have the what and the pattern. We're working on the who." He paused. "But here's the thing about professional arsonists. Mrs. Harper, they work for money, and they leave financial trails. We have a forensic accountant going through Crane's books right now legally through a subpoena that was issued this morning at 6 a.m. by a judge in Maricopa County who does not like Victor Crane." She looked up. "A judge who?" "Crane tried to acquire property adjacent to that judge's family land 3 years ago," Foss said, and there was something very dry in his voice. "He used the same playbook. The judge's family had better attorneys than most of his targets. Crane backed off, but the judge remembered." He closed the folder. "Sometimes the law works slowly. Sometimes it gets personal and works faster." She sat back in her chair. She said, "What happens now?" He said, "This morning we are filing a comprehensive fraud complaint with the Arizona Attorney General's office. Marcus has been on the phone with their office since 5 a.m. We are filing a parallel complaint with the County Sheriff's Criminal Division with our arson report attached. And we are filing a civil suit against Crane personally, against Sonoran Land Holdings, and against the two county employees whose communications we have, seeking damages for the fabricated tax claim, the fraudulent property deed, the coordinated code violations, and the destruction of your garage." He paused. "The total figure we're seeking is significant." She said, "How significant?" He named a number. She stared at him. He said, "Crane has done this to at least 7 property owners in 2 counties over 3 years. The ones who sold did so under duress created by illegal means. Every one of them is potentially a plaintiff. We're talking to them." She said slowly, "You've been building this." He said, "We've been building this for 36 hours, which sounds fast, but it helps when you have the right people making calls at 1 in the morning. He glanced toward the window, toward the sound of work and voices outside. "Your friend Ryder has a network that connects to a great many people in a great many useful places. Not all of them ride motorcycles." She looked out the window. She thought about Ryder nodding in her garage 3 weeks ago, taking in her words about helping somebody else someday with that particular gravity she'd noticed, but not fully understood. She thought about the card he'd left and the way he'd picked up the phone at 2 in the morning and said, "Tell me everything," and then actually listened to all of it. She said he was ready. As Foss said, he'd been watching for someone worth being ready for, I think. He stood and gathered his documents. "I need to make some calls. You have my number. And Mrs. Harper, stay on your property today. I want witnesses around you at all times." She nodded. He went outside and she sat alone at the kitchen table for one more moment. Just one, letting the full weight of the past 3 weeks sit on her and then deliberately setting it down. Not forgetting it, just refusing to carry it into what came next. Then she got up and went outside to help. So, what happened in the next 12 hours was the kind of thing she would spend years trying to describe to people and never quite getting right, because it wasn't really about the building, though. The building was real and it was happening faster than she could have imagined, with the organized efficiency of several hundred people who had clearly done physical work together before, and knew how to subdivide a job without being told twice. It was about something else, something that ran underneath the work like a current. Tom Burt showed up at 8 in the morning with his truck bed loaded with food sandwiches, cold drinks, two big thermoses of coffee, and he stood at the edge of the lot looking at what was happening, with an expression she'd never seen on his face before, something between shock and a kind of profound relief, like a man who'd been holding his breath for weeks and had finally been given permission to exhale. He found her near the foundation where 6 men were already pouring a new concrete pad that was, if she was reading the layout correctly, going to be larger than the original garage by about 30%. He said, "Evelyn." She said, "I know." He said, "There are 500. She said, "I know, Tom." He stood beside her and they watched together for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "Roy would have loved this." She said he would have been out here with a hammer at 6 a.m. Tom laughed, a real laugh, the kind she hadn't heard from him in weeks, and then he went and started handing out sandwiches, and that was how he spent his day. Dolores came at 9. Her truck had been in the garage when it burned, which Evelyn had been sick about, and she'd told Dolores on the phone the morning after the fire, and Dolores had said, "Honey, that's the least of what matters here." Now Dolores arrived with her neighbor and 2 women from her church and a pot of beef stew big enough to feed 30 people, and within an hour there was a whole separate operation running at Evelyn's picnic table that had nothing to do with construction and everything to do with making sure nobody working went hungry. By mid-morning, people from the town were appearing steadily. Not all at once, not as a group, but 1 and 2 at a time, people she knew. People she half knew, some she'd never spoken to directly. The hardware store owner from 2 towns over who arrived with a truck full of donated materials. A retired contractor named Ray, who'd heard what was happening on the radio, apparently because someone had called a local station, and by 9:30 there was a reporter in the lot, and Foss was having a quiet but pointed conversation with her about what could and couldn't be reported while an active legal proceeding was in motion. And through all of it, the bikers worked. That was the thing she kept coming back to, kept watching from whatever corner of the chaos she was standing in. They worked with a focused, unhurried competence that was almost startling, not showing off, not performing for the gathering crowd, just working. She watched a man named Cole, who she'd met briefly in her garage 3 weeks ago, as one of the original 6 spend 45 minutes meticulously straightening the framing for what would become the office corner of the new garage, getting it plumbed to within a fraction of an inch, because he decided that corner was his responsibility, and he was going to do it right. She watched Parrish, the quiet one with a scarred jaw, running electrical conduit with 2 other men moving through the work with the efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. She watched Stretch, the young one, doing whatever needed doing, wherever someone needed another pair of hands, tireless, cheerful, stopping every time he passed Dolores' stew table to say something that made the women laugh. Around noon, Ryder found her and brought her 2 sandwiches and stood beside her while she ate one, both of them looking at the new structure taking shape. He said, "How are you doing?" She said, "I'm trying to figure out how to hold this." He said, "Hold what?" She said, "All of this, what it means. I gave you 1 night of work 3 weeks ago, Ryder. I fixed 6 bikes, and this..." She gestured at the 3 acres of organized, purposeful humanity surrounding her house. "This is not proportionate." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You want to know why people really came?" She said, "Yes, that's exactly what I want to know." He said, "Because most of them have never had anybody open a door. Not a real door, not the kind you open because you look past what somebody looks like and you just see a person who needs help. Most of my guys have walked into 100 towns and watched 100 people look at their patches and decide they already knew everything they needed to know." He paused. Word went out that there was a woman in Arizona who looked at 6 road-dirty, leather-cut strangers at 10 at night in a storm and said, "Come in out of the rain." And what people heard, what I heard when I put out the call, was that that woman was in trouble. He looked at her. "You don't help somebody like that and then leave them to burn." She was quiet for a long moment. She said, "Ryder, does Crane know yet?" "What's happening here?" Ryder said, "He knows." She said, "How do you know he knows?" Ryder said, "Because 40 minutes ago, Foss took a call from Crane's attorney. Crane's attorney is requesting a conversation. Crane wants to talk." She turned and looked at him directly. She said, "What does that mean?" Ryder's expression was calm and something that might on a different face have been a smile. It means 500 motorcycles in your lot means something different to a man like Victor Crane than it does to the rest of us. He paused. It means he's counting them. She said, and what is he counting? Ryder said, witnesses, cameras, a legal team that arrived before he was awake this morning. A story that's already on the local radio. A judge in Maricopa County who subpoenaed his books at 6 a.m. He finally let the almost smile become a real one, just briefly, just for a second. He's counting all the ways this stopped being a situation he controls. She looked back at the new garage going up on the footprint of the old one, bigger, stronger, more solid, built by people who had driven through the night because a woman they'd never met had once treated 6 strangers like human beings. She said, what do we do when Crane wants to talk? Ryder said, we let Foss answer that call, and we keep building. She nodded. She ate the second sandwich. Around 2 in the afternoon, a county vehicle pulled up at the edge of the property. Not a sheriff's car, an inspector's vehicle, and the man who got out was not Rollins, the inspector, who'd come with the clipboard and the 14 manufactured violations. This was a different man, older, with the air of someone senior, who had been sent somewhere he did not particularly want to go. He found Evelyn and introduced himself as the deputy director of the county building division. He said very carefully that in light of an internal review initiated that morning, all pending violation notices against her property were being suspended pending further investigation. He said it was a routine review. She said, of course it is. He said, we apologize for any inconvenience. She said, do you? He left quickly and Foss appeared at her elbow within 30 seconds because Foss had been watching, and he said, that's the first one. The tax claim will follow within 24 hours, I expect. He paused. Crane is retreating. He's pulling the official pressure back because he can't control the narrative anymore. And he knows if this goes to trial, everything we have comes out in open court. She said, and the fraud, the arson, the bribery. He said, that's not his call to make. The AG's office and the sheriff's criminal division are independent. He can settle with you civilly, and he will. I think he'll offer a settlement, but the criminal exposure doesn't go away when he does. She looked at him steadily. She said, I want him to answer for what he did to the Delgados and the Munozes and whoever else. Foss said, I know. That's why we filed the way we filed. He paused. You're not just protecting yourself, Mrs. Harper. You understand that the way we structured this, you're potentially the person who takes down everything he's built in this county for 3 years. She said, good. He nodded once and went back to his calls. She went back to work, not building, because the building was well in hand, but doing what she could, carrying lumber handing tools, making coffee runs, staying in the middle of it, because standing at the edge of it would have been unbearable. She needed to be useful. It was the only way she knew to be. At 4 in the afternoon, Stretch found her and handed her a hammer and said with a grin that made him look about 17 years old, Ryder says you need to put at least 1 nail in this thing. Says it's important. She looked at the hammer. She looked at the new wall of her new garage standing solid and straight in the Arizona afternoon. She took the hammer. She found a nail already set in the framing. Someone had put it there for her, she realized, had chosen the spot and started it so she'd have exactly the right place. And she drove it home in 2 clean strikes, the way Roy had taught her, the way her father before him had taught her. The sound of it rang out across the lot. And something happened that she didn't expect. The nearest group of workers stopped and looked over, and then someone started it clapping, and it spread outward through the lot like a ripple until the whole property was filled with applause. 500 people clapping in the Arizona desert for one woman with a hammer and a nail and a wall that was going to stand. She stood there with the hammer at her side and her eyes full of something she didn't try to stop this time. She let it come. Because Roy had been right. Kindness is a direction. You give it outward and trust that it circulates. It doesn't always come back to you, but sometimes it comes back so loud it shakes the ground. The applause faded slowly, the way good things do not all at once, but in layers, one voice at a time, until the desert took it back, and all that was left was the sound of work resuming and the low hum of people who had found their purpose for the day and were settled into it. Evelyn stood with the hammer still in her hand and let the moment close around her without trying to hold it. Roy had taught her that too, that some things are meant to pass through you, not be kept. You feel them fully and then you let them move on. And what stays behind is not the moment itself, but what the moment made of you. She was different than she'd been 3 weeks ago. She could feel it the way you feel a healed place in your body, not painful anymore, but changed the tissue knit together differently than it was before him. She gave the hammer back to Stretch and said, "Thank you." He shrugged with that easy grin and said, "Ryder's idea," and went back to work. She found Ryder near the back corner of the new structure, talking to one of the crew leads, a heavy-set man named Garza, who'd driven up from Tucson with 6 others, and who appeared to have a near-encyclopedic knowledge of residential and commercial construction code. They were looking at something on a set of plans, talking in the clipped, efficient shorthand of men who know each other's competence and don't need to explain themselves. Ryder saw her and said something to Garza, who nodded and moved off, and then turned to face her. She said, "Foss says Crane wants to talk." Ryder said, "I heard." She said, "I want to be in that conversation." He looked at her for a moment. She could see him deciding whether to push back and then deciding not to. He said, "I'll tell Foss." She said, "It's my property, Ryder. It's my life. I appreciate everything he's doing, but I want to be in the room." He said, "You should be in the room. I wasn't going to argue with you." She said, "You were thinking about it." He almost smiled. "I was thinking Foss might push back." She said, "Then Foss and I will have a short conversation." She found Foss at the picnic table with his phone and his laptop and 3 legal pads covered in his precise small handwriting, and she sat down across from him and said, "I want to be present when you speak with Crane's attorney." Foss looked up. He studied her for exactly 2 seconds. Then he said, "Okay." She said, "I expected more resistance than that." He said, "Mrs. Harper, you've held this situation together by yourself for 3 weeks before any of us showed up. I'm not going to tell you to wait outside." He turned the laptop toward her. "His attorney called again 20 minutes ago. They want to call at 5 o'clock. I have them on speaker, and I want you to listen only unless I indicate you should speak, not because your input isn't valuable, but because anything you say directly becomes part of the record, and I want to control what goes on that record. Is that acceptable?" She said, "That's acceptable." He said, "One more thing. The offer they make today will not be the real offer. The first number is always a test. When they say it, your job is to not react. Can you do that?" She said, "I've been not reacting to things for 3 weeks. He said, "Fair point." At 5 o'clock exactly, Foss made the call. On speaker with Evelyn, sitting across from him at her own kitchen table, her hands flat on the surface, her face composed. A man named Aldrich came on Crane's lead attorney, his voice carrying the particular smooth confidence of someone accustomed to these conversations going his way. Aldrich said that his client was prepared to make a full settlement offer to resolve all outstanding disputes, including the property claim, the tax issue, and the matter of the damaged structure on Mrs. Harper's property. Foss said, "We're listening." Aldrich named a number. It was not a small number. It was, in fact, more money than Evelyn had ever held in her life. Enough to start over, as Crane had said on her porch. Enough to live comfortably for what remained of her years. Foss said, "Thank you. We'll be in touch." Aldrich said, "Mr. Foss, I want to impress upon you that this offer reflects significant goodwill on my client's part and is time-sensitive." Foss said, "I heard you the first time. We'll be in touch." And he ended the call. He looked at Evelyn. She'd kept her face still through all of it, both hands flat on the table, no reaction. She said, "That's not the real offer." He said, "That's not the real offer." She said, "What's missing?" He said, "Criminal liability. That number covers the civil side, your losses, your property, your garage, a pain and suffering component. But it has a confidentiality clause buried in the implied terms, which means if you take it, you can't talk about what he did to you or to anyone else. And more critically," he paused, "it does nothing for the Delgados, the Munozes, or the 5 other property owners we've now confirmed were victimized by the same scheme." She said, "So we don't take it." He said, "I don't recommend it, but I want you to understand what we're choosing instead. If we reject this and go forward, we are in litigation that could take 2 years. The criminal case is out of our hands. The AG's office runs that, not us, but our civil suit goes to discovery depositions trial. It's hard, it's long, and Crane still has resources." She said, "Daniel." She used his first name for the first time, and he blinked slightly. "He burned Roy's garage. He stole a document with Roy's father's forged signature on it. He stood on my porch at midnight and tried to buy me out of my own life. She paused. And he did the same thing to 7 other people who didn't have what I had, a card in their pocket and someone to call. She looked at him steadily. What do I tell them if I take his money and sign his silence clause? Foss was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'll call Aldrich in the morning and tell him the offer has been declined. She said, tell him we're prepared for discovery. He wrote something on his legal pad. I'll tell him exactly that. The bikers worked through the night. She hadn't asked them to, had in fact told Ryder at around 8 in the evening that people needed to rest, that the frame was up and the roof was on, and what remained could wait until morning. Ryder had relayed this to the crew, and the crew had politely and collectively continued working. Not all 500 most had set up camp in the field behind her house, sleeping on bedrolls and in tents, and across the backs of their bikes with the uncomplicated ease of people accustomed to making do. But a rotating crew of 30 or 40 kept going through the night in shifts, and by the time the sun came up, the new garage was not just framed and roofed, but drywalled and wired and plumbed for the utility sink she'd had in the old one. She woke at 5:30 to the smell of coffee. Someone had set up a camp stove at the picnic table and walked outside to find the morning quiet in the way that comes after sustained noise, the particular piece of a place where a great deal of work has been done and the work is almost finished. Parrish was sitting at the picnic table alone with his coffee. He nodded at her when she came out. She poured herself a cup and sat across from him. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then she said, Parrish, how long have you been riding with Ryder? He wrapped both hands around his mug. 14 years. She said, you're not a man who talks much. He said, no, ma'am. She said, but you came? He looked at her directly. His eyes were dark and steady and had seen things she'd never know. He said, where Ryder goes, I go. That's been true for 14 years. He paused. But I'll tell you something else. When word went out about what was happening to you, what that man was doing to you, I'd have come anyway, without Ryder asking. He looked back at his coffee. My grandmother lost her house to a man like that in Mississippi, 1987. She'd been in that house 40 years, and she lost it to a man with a briefcase and a forged document and a county clerk who owed him a favor. His jaw tightened slightly. Nobody showed up for her. Evelyn said nothing. She let the words sit where he'd put them. He said, so I showed up for you. She reached across the table and put her hand over his for just a moment, and he let her, and then they both went back to their coffee in the morning, and nothing more needed to be said. The twist that Victor Crane had not seen coming arrived at 9:47 that morning, and it did not arrive quietly. 2 vehicles pulled up, one a state-marked car from the Arizona Attorney General's office, and the second an unmarked sedan that Foss identified with a single glance and a short exhale as federal. He was at Evelyn's side within 30 seconds, and he said low and controlled, the AG moved faster than I expected, and that second car is FBI. She said FBI. He said the fraud and arson crossed state lines because some of the shell companies used in the property scheme were registered in Nevada and Delaware. That makes it federal. He straightened his jacket. This is a good development. I want you to know that. This is a very good development. The agents were professional and efficient and spoke first with Foss, then with Evelyn, then walked the property and spoke briefly with Ryder, who answered their questions with a calm that suggested this was not the first time federal agents had found reasons to speak with him, and that he'd long since decided the best approach was simple, complete honesty. After they left, Foss called Marcus Webb, and she could hear from Foss's side of the conversation that Webb was somewhere between professional satisfaction and something close to elation, a combination that sounded on him like a man who had wanted this outcome for a long time. She learned that afternoon that Victor Crane had been contacted by the FBI at 10:15 that morning. She learned this not from Foss, but from a phone call she received at 2 p.m. from a number she almost didn't answer. She answered it. Victor Crane's voice came through the line, and it sounded nothing like the voice that had stood on her porch at midnight, or with a rehearsed offer and a cold face. It sounded like a man who had spent the morning realizing the full dimensions of what he'd started and what it had become. He said, Mrs. Harper. She said, Mr. Crane. A silence. Then he said, I want to. He stopped, started again. What I did to your property was wrong, the garage. Another stop. She could hear him working, choosing words with the care of a man who has been told by his attorneys to say certain things and not others. I'm prepared to make that right. She said, I know you are. He said, I hope we can. She said, Victor, I'm going to stop you there. Her voice was level and even, and she felt Roy's steadiness in it like a backbone she'd borrowed and decided to keep. Your attorneys and my attorneys are going to handle the civil side of this. That's their job. But I want you to understand something that no attorney can negotiate for you. She paused. There are 7 families in this county who lost things they can't get back because of what you did. Not just property time. Peace. The feeling of being safe in their own homes. I don't have the ability to give that back to them. But I am going to make sure that what happened to them is on record in detail in a public proceeding so that everyone in this county and beyond it knows exactly what a man with a briefcase and a forged document and a willing county clerk can do to people who trust that the system is honest. She let that land. That's going to happen regardless of what you and I settle today. Do you understand? A very long silence. Then he said, yes. She said, good day, Mr. Crane. She hung up. She sat for a moment in the quiet of Roy's kitchen. Then she went outside because inside felt too small for what she was feeling. Ryder found her in the late afternoon standing at the edge of the new garage, looking at what had been built in 48 hours on the ground where Roy's building had stood for 26 years. It was bigger. Better insulated, Garza had told her. The electrical panel was new and correctly rated. The ventilation was properly engineered. The parts shelf along the back wall had been rebuilt in solid oak by a man named Briggs, who'd done nothing else for 2 days, getting the dimensions exactly right from measurements she'd given him because she'd memorized Roy's original shelf the way you memorize a person's face. It was not Roy's garage, but it was hers. Fully, legally, permanently, irrevocably, hers. Foss had confirmed that morning that the fraudulent property deed had been officially invalidated by the county recorder's office under instruction from the AG, and that the fabricated tax debt had been formally withdrawn. The land was clean, the title was clear. Ryder stood beside her and they looked at it together. She said, I want to ask you something. He said, ask. She said, that night in my original garage, when I told you to help somebody else someday, did you think it would ever actually come to this? He was quiet for a moment, considering it honestly. Then he said, I thought about it a lot on the road after we left. The way you said it, it wasn't a platitude. You meant it like an instruction, like you were passing something on. He paused. I've had people be decent to me in my life, but most of them were decent because it cost them nothing. You were decent when it could have cost you, when everybody in that town was locked behind their doors and you opened yours. He looked at her. That kind of thing doesn't get filed away. It gets carried. She said, I didn't do it to be carried. He said, I know. That's exactly why it was. She looked at the garage. She thought about Roy building the first one board by board over 2 summers, refusing to cut corners, building it to last. She thought about the night it burned, the way the light of it had looked from her yard orange against the dark, and the way she'd felt watching it, that complete and total grief. And she thought about the fact that what stood in its place now was better not as a replacement, because you can't replace something Roy built with his hands, but as something new built by 500 people who'd come from 6 states because a message had gone out on a network of roads, and trust and obligation, and they'd come. She said, how do I thank 500 people? Ryder said, you don't. That's the point. You pass it forward. She said, like you did. He said, like we all did. She nodded. Then she said, stay for dinner. All of you, whatever's left of all of you, I'm going to cook. He looked at her. Flynn, there are still about 200 people on your property. She said, then I'll need more pasta. He laughed a real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind she suspected he didn't let out very often, and it was the best sound she'd heard in weeks. They ate in the field as the sun went down. 200 people spread across the land that was fully and legally hers, and she cooked, and Tom Birch cooked, and Dolores cooked, and 3 women from the church who'd been coming and going for 2 days cooked. And there was enough because there is always enough when enough people decide to make it so. After dinner, when it was dark and the stars were out, the way they get in the Arizona desert, total and overwhelming. Like the sky is trying to make a point. She sat in Roy's chair that someone had carried outside for her, and Ryder sat in the dirt beside her with his coffee, and the field was full of quiet voices and the occasional sound of a lighter, and the low murmur of men who had worked hard and were at rest. She said, Ryder, Why did all of you really come? He'd been expecting some version of this question. She could tell by the way he didn't rush to answer, just sat with it for a moment, turning it over, finding the true words rather than the easy ones. Then he said, because people spend their whole lives deciding who we are before they know us. We ride into a town and they lock their doors, and we know we've always known what the locked door means. It means you've already been tried and convicted by someone who's never said your name. He paused. You didn't lock your door. You opened it at 10 o'clock on a stormy night, and you made coffee, and you worked until 3:30 in the morning, and you refused our money, and you told us to help somebody else. He looked up at the stars. Round here, that's the kind of thing that travels. That's the kind of thing people remember. And when the call went out that the woman who opened her door was having her door burned down, he stopped, shook his head slowly. There wasn't a conversation about whether to come. There was only a conversation about how fast. She sat with that. The field was quiet around her. The stars were doing what stars do in the desert, which is remind you that you are small and brief, and that this fact is not a tragedy but a relief. She thought about Roy. She thought about him building the first garage, and about the way he'd handed tools to strangers on the side of the road for 40 years without being asked, and about the way he'd looked at her once early in their marriage, when she'd asked him why he always stopped, why he never just drove past. He'd said, because they're people, Ev. That's it. That's the whole reason. That's it. That's the whole reason. She said, he would have liked you. Ryder said, who? She said, Roy. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, tell me about him. So she did. She talked about Roy for a long time in the dark, with Ryder listening the way he'd listened to her on the phone that first night, completely without filling the space, letting her find her own way through it. She talked about the garage and the shelf and the coffee mug and the way he drove always 10 miles under the speed limit, which had driven her crazy for 40 years and which she now found herself doing without thinking. She talked about his hands and his patience and the way he'd believed without sentimentality and without naivety that people were worth the effort. When she finished, the night had gone deep and most of the voices in the field had gone quiet. Ryder said, he sounds like somebody who knew how to live. She said, he did. He really did. So, in the morning they left. Not all at once, over the course of a few hours, engines starting up one at a time, and then in groups, the sound building, and then spreading outward down the road to the highway. She stood on her porch and watched them go, and many of them nodded as they passed or raised a hand, and a few stopped briefly to say something directly to her. Thank you for letting us come, ma'am, and you take care of yourself now. And from Cole, who'd spent 2 days getting a corner, perfectly plumb, that wall's going to stand 100 years. Stretch was near the end. He pulled up to the edge of the porch and stopped and said, you going to be okay? She said, I'm going to be more than okay. He nodded like that was the answer he'd needed. Then he said, when I told you that first night that nobody ever opened a door for us, he stopped, looked down at his handlebars, then back at her. I just want you to know that I'm going to remember that you did. For the rest of my life, I'm going to remember it. She said, then use it. When you see someone who needs a door opened, you open it. Don't think about it. Just open it. He said, yes, ma'am. He rode away. Ryder was last. He sat on his bike at the edge of her lot for a moment. After everyone else had gone, the desert quiet again around them, and he looked at the new garage standing solid in the morning light. He reached into his breast pocket and held something out to her. She stepped off the porch and took it. It was the same business card he'd given her before, except on the back, in his handwriting, day or night, always. She looked up at him. He said, you have my number, don't lose it this time. She said, I never lost it. He smiled the full, real smile she'd seen only a handful of times and said, I know. Then he rode away down the road, and she stood in her lot and listened to the sound of his engine fading into the desert until there was nothing left but the wind and the birds and the solid, settled silence of her land. Her land, fully hers, legally, permanently, irrevocably hers. She turned and looked at what remained. The new garage. Roy's parts shelf rebuilt in solid oak. The clean concrete pad. The correctly wired electrical panel. The windows that let in more light than the old ones had. A structure built by 500 people who'd driven through the night because one woman had once made coffee and refused to take money and said help somebody else someday. She went inside and poured herself a cup of coffee in Roy's mug, the one that said world's okayest mechanic, and she carried it out to the new garage and set it on the new workbench and stood there in the space that smelled of fresh lumber and concrete and the particular clean smell of a building that is just beginning its life. She put her hand flat on the workbench the way she'd put it flat on the old one 1,000 times. She said quietly to no one and to Roy and to the 40 years they'd built together and to the last 3 weeks and to the 500 people who'd carried something she'd passed along. Without knowing its weight, she said, okay. And then she got to work. Victor Crane was indicted by a federal grand jury 11 weeks later on charges of wire fraud conspiracy to commit arson, bribery of public officials, and racketeering. 6 of the 7 families whose properties had been illegally targeted joined the civil suit. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and the verdict was not close. Crane's resort project was never built. The garage on the old Arizona highway became the kind of place that people talked about in the way people talk about places that mean something beyond their function. A roadside mechanic shop run by a woman with grease-stained hands and gray hair, and a coffee pot that was always on, and a policy unwritten but absolute of never turning away anyone who needed help. Travelers stopped there for years, not always knowing why, exactly, drawn by something that had no name, but that you felt the moment you pulled into the gravel lot. Something that said you are not a stranger here. Come in out of the rain. And on the back wall of the garage, above Roy's rebuilt parts shelf, hung a framed piece of paper. Not a certificate, not a diploma, just a handwritten note on plain white paper in Ryder's handwriting, the same blocky, deliberate script she'd seen on the back of the business card. It said, "She opened the door. We didn't forget." That was all. That was everything. Some things once given freely into the world do not diminish. They multiply. They travel roads you never walked and reach people you never met, and return to you changed larger, louder than anything you started, in the form of 500 headlights coming down your road at dawn when you needed them most. Evelyn Harper knew that now, the way she knew engines, not as theory but as truth she'd held in her hands. Kindness is not quiet. Kindness given without fear and without condition is the loudest thing there is, and it never ever burns.